We have in the first reading an example of probably the very words of the one being quoted. It comes through in all its power, even in translation. My son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I had died in your place, Absalom, my son, my son. Even though Absalom was dying on the wrong side, as they say, blood is thicker than water, and the father feeling is there. It is always very hard to bury a son or a daughter. Human grief is something which traverses the century and will go on to the end of time. And we find it in the Gospel as well, so much so that the Lord intervenes and takes away the pain. This little damsel of 12 years of age is told to get up, Talitha kum, and she does. In the meantime, there has been this other occurrence which could have remained completely hidden. This lady who had spent all her poor meagre earnings and savings on doctors and it only got worse, and was therefore in a desperate state with her hemorrhage. But with regard to touching when one is in this flow of blood, that is something which in the Mosaic law would render impure the person being touched. Therefore she is afraid to make it known. But the Lord wants the glory of God to be enthroned, therefore, and made public, and he will have this declared. The Hebrew language does not have a direct word for our give thanks, thank. It does actually have an equivalent, which we can translate as that. But the actual word, irach, is based on confessing. Irach is the actual word of casting out. It can actually be stones initially, but then it can be telling forth, especially in the fortified, the strong form of the hifil, a kind of reflexive, and it's there used regularly in the Psalms, for instance, confess, and it comes through into the Latin, the Vulgate, as confitemini. Actually, it's come into a Tese chant, confitemini Domino quoniam bonus. And the confessing then of the works of God becomes a way of honouring God. And it is good to do that, either in conversation or in preaching. It is good to make known the glories of God in concrete terms. Only yesterday I was talking to someone whose mother was very seriously ill years and years ago and was quite desperate in hospital and was going to be operated on for something very serious, and she was terrified. But she had a great devotion to one particular saint and was invoking him much. And the eve of the operation, she was there and she received the visit of a doctor. But he was dark-skinned. At least she thought he was a doctor like any other. And she was greatly comforted by his words that everything would be all right. Eventually she inquired of the staff who that lovely doctor were, and they were quite clear that no doctor had been there. No one had passed, and certainly no one of that description. There had been no one in her room, and they knew all those who came and went. Eventually the operation was successful, and she realized who that visitor was. The same thing happened to a friend of mine years ago in Cardiff. She had a great devotion to the very same saint. She was of Irish descent, and in Ireland this particular saint is very popular, and was even more so actually before he was actually canonized and made officially a saint. Blessed Martin de Porres, who had exercised the medical art before becoming a Dominican brother. And he was a metic, he was half and half, therefore dark-skinned, there in Latin America. He came, it would seem, to the rescue of someone who to this day knows nothing about it. And the story is as follows. It was on the busy Cowbridge Road near where we lived that this good Protestant, well actually he was a Salvation Army faithful believer, was knocked down and probably mortally wounded. He was on the road and this car got into him, and that was apparently the end of him, going to be anyway. There was probably no hope. And he was there in hospital, and nevertheless, because he wasn't yet dead, this lady was praying hard for him and invoking the intercession of this great saint to whom she had this personal devotion. Eventually a gentleman did come to, against all expectation, and he said, having come to, I was lying on the ground, that is when he was in his comatose state, and this gentleman, dressed in such and such a way, quite strange, white, with this black thing on him, he was dark-skinned, and he pulled me up. So the lady, out of delicacy, did not say exactly who that person was and what the story behind it was, because he was a Salvation Army person. She did not want to offend his faith or his conscience or anything with regard to his interior domain. But she knew perfectly well that her simple prayer had been answered, just as the simple prayer of the mother of the person I was talking to yesterday had been answered years ago. The prayer of the simple, cri de cœur, a cry from the heart, it reaches heaven. And in Africa we have much faith. As in Ireland we have, amongst the travelling people especially, much simple faith. They come a long way for blessings and prayers. So in simple cultures we have that openness which in sophisticated cultures sometimes finds greater resistance. And it is to the simple that God often comes. The Lord, in fact, confesses precisely the Father for revealing these mysteries to the humble and simple. But I was preaching on this gospel years ago in Italy, in front of, I suppose, about 500 people, because in those situations there in the summer months, the church is packed in our monastery, and there, precisely, it was an occasion to enthrone God and to confess Him. And this good young African was with me. He was about 19 years of age, and I knew, because he told me the story, that something had happened in his village or one of the nearby villages, and I felt it was exactly the parallel case, that it was not right, that this should remain in a corner. So I asked him to come right next to me for a part of the homily, and I asked him questions, and then I translated his answers from French into Italian, and precisely he just explained what had happened. And it was, in that simple situation of an African village, the priest, who had faith, but was perhaps misbehaving, we don't quite know what was going on, but the Lord perhaps wanted to give him a lesson, or maybe his faith was in fact weak, and he was celebrating the sacred mysteries, and just as he got to the end of the Eucharistic prayer, as he elevated the paten and the chalice of the doxology, he was singing through him, with him, in French, and he had to stop, because it had been transformed in his hands into visible flesh and blood. So I continued to ask this young man what kind of flesh and blood, and he just calmly answered, noir, black. The Lord identifies himself with his simple people. That is the message that our present Holy Father would have us understand. Do not forget the poor, whispered one of the cardinals next to him when they saw which way the Holy Spirit was blowing. The Lord has a predilection for the uncomplicated. Pray from the heart. In the name of the Lord, Hosanna, Hosanna, Hosanna in the highest, Hosanna, Hosanna, Hosanna in the highest. Per ipsum et cum ipso et in ipso est tibi Deo Patri omnipotenti in unitate Spiritus Sancti omnes honor et gloria per omnia saecula saeculorum. Amen. Lamb of God, you take away the sins of the world, have mercy on us. Lamb of God, you take away the sins of the world, have mercy on us. Lamb of God, you take away the sins of the world, grant us peace. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are the meek, for they shall possess the land. Confite mini Domino, quoniam bonus. Confite mini Domino, alleluia. Confite mini Domino, quoniam bonus. Confite mini Domino, alleluia. Confite mini Domino, quoniam bonus. Confite mini Domino, alleluia.